Why is it that we hate paedophiles so much? It seems obvious, doesn't it? It seems like it's a question that doesn't need to be asked. It appears self-evident. They want to have sex with children, or rape them, to be clear, since they can't actually have sex with children due to them being unable to consent. They can only rape them, because one can't have sex with someone without consent. And that's an entirely right and correct distinction, a solid principle that decent societies, such as we, at least until recently, have in the West. And it is a solid principle, since it has logically and reasonably and morally found its way even into the marital bed, where once it was out of bounds. Even a husband cannot, in law, rape his wife. In the world of grown-ups, and due to the nature of sexual relations which overwhelmingly take place in private, untangling consent is a tricky business. Most of the time it boils down to her word against his, and because the fairest way we know of establishing truth from lies is to put it to the test of 12 men and women picked almost at random from the population. The defendants, and often the accusers' veracity is judged by their peers. It's not perfect, but it's the best we've got. And because it's a solid principle, it holds fast when judging the nature of sexual encounters in the young. But a solid principle needs a clear line, and in the UK that clear line is 16 years old. In law, nobody in the United Kingdom is permitted to have sexual intercourse before their 16th birthday. Of course, once we zoom in closer, that clear line becomes a great deal less clear. Nakedness and sexual acts which don't amount to intercourse do muddy the water somewhat. A quick glance at the age of consent across Europe shows that it does vary quite a bit. Shockingly for me, as someone with daughters, that line is only 14 in Germany, Austria, Italy and Portugal, as well as Estonia and most of the Balkan countries. But everybody in each country knows where that line is. There are sensible nuances regarding underage sex in view of moderate age differences in randy teenagers. That thankfully prevents the law from blundering in where it's not required. But the principle nevertheless holds. There was a case in England a few years ago of a teacher in his 30s who had absconded abroad with a 15-year-old schoolgirl. It was fairly clear that there was no coercion involved and that the relationship was consensual. A frankly surprising number of people in my experience, in the press as well as in personal conversations, viewed the whole episode like it was some passionate and doomed tragic love story. The star-crossed lovers eloping in the dead of night to be together and be damned what convention, decency and the law might have to say about it. But, quite rightly, this couldn't be allowed to stand. A European arrest warrant was issued for the teacher for abduction, and a week or two later the couple were identified in southern France. The girl was taken into protective custody, returned to her parents, and the teacher was arrested and extradited back to the UK. Although, as I say, it appeared that the relationship, such as it was not one of any degree of cruelty, the teacher quite clearly broke the law. The girl was 15, legally still a minor, and was therefore unable in law to give consent. Throw in the particular issue of a teacher abusing his position of trust, and that a man in his 30s should know better and should have been capable of exercising restraint, then the outcome could hardly have been any different. Had he been able to exercise that minimal amount of restraint, he could have bided his time until the girl's 16th birthday, and they could have made the decision to be together, which no one, not the state, not the girl's parents, nor society at large, could have torn asunder. If he had resigned from his job into the bargain, he could have been home free without a stain, an official one at least, on his record, if not his character. He might even have been able to obtain another teaching post. As it was, not only will he never be able to teach again, or even work with children or young people, but he had to spend some time in prison, with an entry into the sex offenders register into the bargain, which is a stain that will never go away. There was a line in the sand. He knew where the line was, and he crossed it. But this guy, weak, irresponsible, and criminal, as he undoubtedly was not what we usually think of when we think of paedophiles and child molesters. His weakness means that others in the future will not be able, or even be inclined, to make that distinction when they look up his name in the register. But the fact that we have such a document clearly illustrates the revulsion and the fear we all have of such people in our midst. But what's the basis of this fear? We all have sexual urges, and we all know how powerful they can be. And all of us whose urges are normal can thank our lucky stars that they are. Those urges, when reciprocated, form the very basis of our society. As Orson Welles opined, if it wasn't for that, we'd all be squatting naked in caves, eating raw meat. But powerful they are, capable of bringing embarrassment and shame, ruining careers and reputations, wrecking marriages, and even bringing down empires. We know this, and so when the sexual urge is directed where it shouldn't be, we are on our guard. We know that it can't be turned off. We assume, probably correctly, that once a pedo, always a pedo. There is too much evidence for us to believe anything else. And even if there was some evidence to the contrary, who would chance it? Nobody. Our children are so precious, so invaluable to us, that even if chemical castration, for instance, was shown to be foolproof and lifelong, so much so that the human being that had been so castrated was sexually an empty vessel, we'd still never trust them. It's just not worth the risk. Who cares if this guy is full of remorse? Who cares if he's turned a new leaf? Who cares, we'd say. He's never getting near my kids. Because how can we trust them when they've done such a thing? How can we trust them when they have betrayed the trust innocently gifted to them by a child? How can we trust them when they would knowingly harm a child? How can we trust them after they have betrayed our trust by getting close to us so they can get close to our children? And how can we trust them when they would potentially damage a child for life to satisfy such a perverted desire? It's because we feel we can never completely separate the person from the sexual urge. Our sexual desire is as much a part of us, we believe, as is our desire to eat. Just imagine that the person you're most attracted to in the whole world, hopefully they'll be your husband or wife, boyfriend or girlfriend, and then imagine that it was just not allowed. Imagine that it was not only not allowed, but that in pursuing that desire could earn you a lifetime in prison, or even the electric chair. Would you be able to turn it off? And that, I think, is why we fear and are so revolted by paedophiles, quite apart from the more sophisticated moral outrages. We know that they can't turn it off. Consequently, they can never be trusted. Ever. Although the sexual urge is in some ways mysterious, it is nevertheless something that we do understand, even if it is only on a visceral level. But there is something that has recently come into our society which is not so easily understood, but seems every bit as compulsive, every bit as uncontrollable, and every bit as untrustworthy as the perverted desires of paedophiles. It is something to be suspicious of, to be feared, to be guarded against, and if all else fails, to be eliminated. It is not an urge, but merely a faith. But that faith has been elevated to such a level that its adherents not only seem ready to die for it, but actively wish for death, so long as they can take as many of their enemies and their enemies are anybody who doesn't share their faith with them. And the suspicion, the fear of this faith, we could call it a prejudice, tends to be something that only those with a firmer connection to their visceral selves will more readily recognise and will understand. I don't fully understand it, but then maybe that's just because I'm too wrapped up in my own image of myself as a civilised man. I say I don't understand it, but sometimes I feel something like an ugliness in myself that only rises in me when I hear of something or witness something equally as ugly. And it frightens me. It frightens me that I feel myself listening less and less to the rational, civilised man inside, and more to the visceral, atavistic and more basic human animal that responds more crudely and more readily to stimulus such as in-group preference. Yeah, the racist is in there. He's in me, as he is in all of us, and he's being provoked. Maybe it's the ugliness of the warrior, who has seen too much to remain rational, like the American soldiers who, according to some accounts, went on a killing spree after encountering the horrors of Dachau. Once such things are seen, the thin veneer of civilization really doesn't stand a chance. And perhaps it shouldn't. There is a time for civility, and there is a time for its opposite. But what is its opposite? Barbarism? Savagery? Bestiality? Maybe it's just vengeance. And who could blame those soldiers for wreaking vengeance on those Nazi guards? Who else was going to do it? Surely not the emaciated, half-dead Jewish inmates who could barely stand, let alone hold a rifle. If ever there was a time for inhumanity, in defence of humanity, it must have been then. But those guys were there, on the ground. They were able and willing, and perhaps most of all, equipped to serve a summary justice that was required, that was necessary, and that was even desirable. But how do you serve justice when you're not there, but you know that unspeakable things have been done to innocents, are still being done, and will, most likely, continue to be done? What should we do at such times? Do we sit back and have faith in the official machinery of justice? Can we be confident that the actors that are charged with pursuing and delivering that justice are pursuing it? Can we be confident that they will, as they should, stop at nothing to bring child rapists to justice? Can we? Or will they stop at political expediency? Will they stop when community cohesion is threatened? Will they stop because they would rather that followers of a particular faith not have their feelings hurt, their pride affronted, or their decency called into question, than deliver real, genuine and uncompromising justice to thousands and thousands of innocent, completely innocent, young girls? Imagine for a moment that you were one of those girls. And I'm not going to go into the vile details of what exactly was done to them. You can all use your imagination for that. But just imagine what it must have been like for her afterwards, after she was tossed away as if she were nothing, less than nothing in fact. Imagine what her worldview was afterwards. She had thought her dad would look after her, and yet he wasn't able to. She had been taught, as we all had, that she lived in a civilised country where such things didn't happen, and yet they just had. She had been taught that the police would protect her, and they didn't. Tell the truth, she had been taught, as all of us have, and all will be well. And she did, and it wasn't. She told the truth, and she was told she was a liar. And imagine what it has been like for her in the months and the years afterwards. Because it doesn't stop there, even after the abuse has stopped. She has to live with the consequences. When she finally reaches puberty, and there is nothing to be curious about, no opportunities to experiment with her at her own pace, since she already knows what men do. When a shy boy approaches her, because he's interested in the girl that is becoming a woman, and she is repulsed by the innocence of his interest, and instead sees that interest as the same as the depraved interest that was shown to her. How will she find her way afterwards into the arms of a man who will love her? Will she forever shun them all, or will she instead repeatedly enter into squalid and grubby liaisons, driven by a compulsion she cannot understand herself, with men who will always abuse her? And when finally someone, anyone, decides to blow the lid on this nasty little secret, she takes notice. At last she feels, now someone is talking about it. It may even be that she herself didn't know that what was done to her was wrong. After all, nobody said it was. Nobody said it was wrong for a 12-year-old girl to have a 45-year-old boyfriend. Even when seeking some guidance from the confusion swirling around her, she told people, grown-up people like the police and social workers, because they didn't say it was wrong, and she had convinced herself that perhaps it wasn't wrong, even though it felt like it. So when somebody starts talking about it, maybe she has some hope that her instincts were right. It was wrong after all. And then it's in the newspapers and on the telly. And then there's this one bloke called Tommy Robinson who seems to be talking about it more than most. And he talks about it more and more. And people start to get angry. And maybe you might actually be making a difference. And then some of those men, like the men who hurt her, start to go to prison. And then they instead send Tommy Robinson to prison. Imagine what it's like for her then, afterwards. Because she's back where she was. And all the people who thought she were important, like the police and social workers and lawyers and judges and television reporters, are back and telling Tommy Robinson that he's the one that's wrong. Imagine what it's like for her afterwards, just when she thought that the world was turning the right way up again. And imagine what it's like for her now. So when compared to her suffering, her pain and her feelings, who gives a flying fuck about the feelings of anybody else? Nobody should give a toss what anybody thinks. Nobody except her and all those thousands of girls and young women who are left at the mercy of those disgusting perverts. What we are experiencing in the West, and in Britain in particular, are conditions that are creating the perfect storm for an all-out, not race, but rather religious war. Firstly, constant provocation from a violent, intemperate, intolerant and uncompromising ideology, whose followers appear quite mad in the confidence of their idiotic delusions. Secondly, an establishment whose institutions appear to have fallen under the very same spell as the ideology that seeks to overthrow it, by repeatedly emboldening and encouraging it, by turning a blind eye to its violent narrative, as well as to its actual violence, whilst at the same time persecuting any and all that dare to challenge that narrative and that violence. And lastly, an enormous population of the disenfranchised, disenchanted and vilified, whose good and genuinely tolerant nature is being used against them, and whose backs are increasingly against the wall and will soon have nothing else to lose. If that's not a powder keg, I don't know what is. A recent survey found that 88% of Muslims consider Britain a good place to live. an overwhelming 94% said that they could practice their religion freely in the UK, and a frankly whopping 86% of Muslims felt a strong sense of belonging to Britain, which is 4 points higher than the national average. Now, as someone who feels deeply that we can and should be able to live together in relative harmony, that really is something that we can work with. It really is. But that survey also revealed some deeply troubling attitudes that rather begs an obvious question. Can we trust you? And this is a genuine question. It's a question to which I would dearly like and desperately seek an answer in the affirmative. For instance, I've recently read this, which is basically a conversation between Maajid Nawaz, a man for whom I have the greatest respect, and Sam Harris, who is basically asking Nawaz the same question. But despite Nawaz's goodwill, who seems to suggest that the key is in wresting the interpretation of the Quran away from the extremists, I remain unconvinced as yet of the efficacy of that approach. Maybe I'm wrong, since Nawaz almost certainly knows the minds of Muslims better than I, but I'm far from reassured. And I'm aware, painfully aware, that this kind of talk eventually can lead all the way to the gas chambers. I'm aware of that. But the road to the gas chambers is much less likely to be taken if we can have a proper, honest, unflinching, difficult, and yes, possibly offensive, and even a downright insulting discussion. We need to clear the air. There's simply no avoiding it. Because how can we trust you when 66% of you would harbour someone who was supporting terrorism in Syria? How can we trust you when 52% of you believe that homosexuality should be illegal in Britain? How can we trust you when 32% of you refuse to condemn violence against those who mock the Prophet? How can we trust you when 34% of you refuse to condemn outright those who take part in stoning those who commit adultery? And how can we trust you when 23% of you would support Sharia law in place of British law? And finally, how can we trust you when 4% of you sympathise with those who carry out suicide bombings? Only 4%, you say? Well, that must mean that the 96% do not sympathise. Indeed, but in a Muslim population of 2.8 million, 4% still equates to 112,000 people across the UK. On September the 11th, 2001, just 19 dedicated and fanatical Muslims managed to kill 3,000 defenceless Americans. And so it's come to this, has it? It's come to this that someone like me, someone who's had a lifetime of believing that people could happily live together, so long as a few conditions are met: freedom to speak one's mind, tempered by a respect for one another's cultures and ways of life that at the same time don't impact unduly upon one another, backed by a foundation in the rule of law and under the umbrella of a truly impartial justice system that respects all citizens as free individuals. That someone like me now feels that he may have to abandon those noble ideals in order simply to survive. Has it really, really come to this? I hope not.